When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Guy YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be talking about number 96 on my list, Brandon Stark. Again, this is a really tough one for me to actually rank Brandon Stark because he's pivotal to the story that we know of and we love, but he's a character that inherently we don't have a lot of the story of, right? We just know generally what happened in his life, but he's a character that's not heavily expanded upon. We don't know a lot about the character outside of a few key occurrences. And so that's the hard part of the character, because as of like another character like we did last week, this character, you kind of have to connect some dots and kind of like draw upon their experiences, the results of their actions to kind of figure out as who he is as a character. I still wanted him to be on this list because I think he's a relevant figure to the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. And so I thought I should put him on here. But let me know what you guys think about number 96 being Bran. Do you think he should have been on this list? Do you think maybe he should have been higher? Let me know. I know these lists are very divisive given there's just so many characters. You're bound to have favorites over other characters and all that. But let's talk about Brandon Stark. But before we do, if you did want to become a member, you do get videos early. And also you get some exclusive content as we get closer to House of the Dragon. Did want to say a massive thank you to that do support me on Patreon and our members on this channel. Let's get into Brandon Stark. So Brandon Stark is a character that I think we should start with a quote because it really explores who he was, his upbringing, and what the character was kind of all about. Ned Stark says to Catelyn Stark, "Brandon, yes. Brandon would know what to do. He always did. It was all meant for Brandon. You, Winterfell, everything. He was born to be a king's hand and father to queens. I never asked for this cup to pass to me." Again, that really explores the character of who Brandon is. Brandon was the character that was brought up to be the Lord of Winterfell. He was the one getting all of the he was the one getting all the teaching. He was the best swordsman of all of the Starks. He was, in a lot of ways, the one that was getting the most attention. Very comparable to Robb, right? Robb is the one being taught all the lessons to become the Lord of Winterfell and all those things by Ned. And so when you have that idea, it really helps establish what his early life would have looked like, very similar to Robb's. But let's also look at the appearance of Brandon Stark. What did he look like and who was he? Brandon was an appearance and character very different from his younger brother Ned. He had gray eyes and was tall and even described as handsome. He was rather hot-blooded, a trait their father, Lord Rickard, described as originating from the Wolfwood. Brandon shared his trait with his sister Lyanna. But Brandon was the best swordman among his siblings and an excellent jouster. He loved to hone his sword, preferring it to be as sharp as possible. He also loved to ride, Barbary Dustin even noting he was one of the best, if not the best. Brandon also loved women, something we're going to talk about as we go through in this video. But Brandon Stark was born in 262 AC at Winterfell. Again, very interesting given the fact that we know Brandon Stark is going to die in 282 AC, making his death at only the age of 20. Very similar to like a character of Robb Stark. He died very young. Again, a lot of comparisons can be drawn from the characters of Robb and Brandon Stark. Both were the heirs to Winterfell, both went south and did not come back up north, and both died down south. Had their fathers die as well. Now, one more brutal than the other, but both had their fathers die when going south. Now, something that's very curious that we do see here is very differently from what we see with like Robb, for instance, in terms of the main story. Brandon was fostered at Barrow Town with Lord Dustin. Very interesting. It seems as though Rickard Stark was trying to kind of get his son in a place where he was also going to learn about the North, but making better ties with other families. Now, what I find quite fascinating here is that given we don't know a lot about Ned and Brandon's mother, was this done because there maybe wasn't like a strong motherly figure around? So Rickard thought, hey, let's give him a situation where that's a more stable family type thing. It's possible. We also know that Rickard did like fostering his children off, right? He fosters Ned off to the Vale with Jon Arryn. We also see Lyanna ends up going south, spending a lot of time in the south as well. He is someone that seems like he liked putting his children to be fostered by others. And so that's something that I think is very relevant here. But we know in his early years in Barrow Town, he actually ends up having a very close relationship with Barbary Risewell, or eventually would become Barbary Dustin. He would spend a lot of his time riding in the hills. Again, he comes off as this character very similar to even Bran in the normal story. Bran wanted to ride a lot. He wanted to be this great knight. Very similar to kind of like Brandon, for instance. And so we see him eventually actually take the maidenhead of Barbary Dustin. So, or at the time, Barbary Risewell. So that is quite interesting. It tells you a lot about Brandon, that Brandon was not exactly the guy who cared as much about, you know, having sex out of wedlock. He didn't seem to actually care about that. And so it's very different in terms of the Starks, the other Starks, in terms of like Ned. But yeah, that's very interesting, because what do we have to be thinking here if you are Brandon? Did Brandon, you know, maybe do this because he thought he was going to marry Barbary Risewell? Did he do this because he just lusted after her? All of those things are very possible. And we also see, again, another comparison to Robb Stark. Robb ends up sleeping with Jane Westerling, even though he was vowed to another. And we're going to see that end up popping up here, as he was eventually betrothed to Catelyn Tully of Riverrun. So a lot of similarities there. Now, what I would be interested in is if this was his intention, right? If that was the intention, was to marry Brandon to a Southern house, why not try and have Brandon be fostered in a Southern house? Like, even in the Riverlands would have been great. I do find that quite interesting. Was it because he wanted Brandon, the future Lord of Winterfell, possible Warden of the North, to be growing up in the North? Is that probably why? That makes a lot of sense, right? You do need to be kind of in proximity of the people you're going to rule. That makes a lot of sense. But it is interesting. So he is, again, betrothed to Catelyn. And this is a very big wedding, right? This would be a very big event in terms of Westeros. 2 of the 7 kingdoms are banding together within a marriage alliance pact. And when you also had things that were also going on at this time in terms of Lyanna and Robert also being betrothed at this time, you again see that there were these bigger plans that Rickard Stark had. And we also get this note, just as a little, I don't know, I guess a nice big up moment for Brandon, is that Brandon is considered to be more handsome than Ned, right? Ned is not considered to be the most handsome guy in the world, but Brandon definitely does have that he did, like, have the eyes of women. But Barbary swore that Brandon did not want to marry Catelyn, but Lord Rickard's ambitions did not allow him to marry the daughter of a northern bannerman. Also, it seems that there is some maester play, is what Barbary alludes to, and I think that's possible, but I also think Rickard was someone that was just very ambitious, right? He wanted more power. He wanted to grow this alliance, because the Targaryens at this time, they were kind of losing more and more power, becoming more and more unstable. And so I think it made a lot of sense to give yourself some protection. Now, the North, it almost feels like the North should be the last region doing this, given they're by far the safest region outside of maybe Dorne, where it's like you can't really invade them. But I understand why he would have wanted to do that. Now, I can also believe maybe Barbary here, that Brandon didn't want to marry Catelyn. Again, Catelyn was in the South. The 2 would have grown up together, probably had a deeper connection. And so meeting someone new, you know, bringing this Southern girl north, it probably would have made a lot more sense for Brandon that he would have just wanted to marry Barbary Dustin. So I can see why he would have wanted to do that. But we kind of have a skip here, right? We just don't know a lot about Brandon Stark up until Robert's Rebellion. Now, what we could have also seen during this time is he probably would have spent a lot of time training, being a good swordsman, being a good jouster, kind of preparing himself, and getting up his reputation for being the person that would lead the North in the future. Again, the North respects power, as well as being someone that cannot back down, right? Not being, you know, a scared individual, kind of showing what Robb had to do with the North as well, showing them his power and that he wasn't a kid. We also see at 281 Brandon present at the tourney of Harrenhal. And I think a lot of people remember Brandon for almost fighting Rhaegar, but he also was there for other reasons, right? He had multiple things that was going on. He was introduced to Howland Reed by his sister Lyanna at some point of the feast, and also during the opening feast of the tourney, Brandon asked Ashara Dane to dance with Ned, who was too shy to ask her himself. And again, I think we've kind of had some theories over the time on this channel about what that means. And on one account, I think it's possible Brandon could have tried, maybe had a crush on Ashara or something like that. So they had some relationship already, given that she was the beauty of the world at this time. And so I think that's possible. I also think it's possible that Brandon was just trying to be a good brother, introducing, Ned to Ashara. Ned obviously had a crush on her. So again, there's two ways you can kind of look at that idea, but it does kind of bring up a question here, because we do know, like, this comes exactly from George R. R. Martin about Brandon. So I do think it'd be interesting, like, was Brandon sleeping with Ashara, and maybe that's Ashara's dead child, like that's how she got that child. But I want to give this quote in the middle of this. It'd be an exaggeration to say that Brandon just died before he could have children. It's established in the books he was no virgin. He could very well have left behind some little snows in the various places he visited. But what's absolutely clear is that he had no legitimate children. Again, that's interesting, right? Because based upon what we know, Brandon had no children. Like, not even bastards. We don't hear about any of that. But George is not closing that door. It's very possible he could have. So could he have, had a relationship with Ashara? Maybe. It's possible. I wouldn't, discount it. Given the fact that George has quite literally just told us that, yeah, I mean, it's possible, right? He is definitely somebody that was lusty, and maybe he would have gone after Ashara. We don't know. But we also know during this tournament that Brandon later entered the lists, but was unhorsed by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. A very unfortunate move for all of Westeros. If Brandon had beaten Rhaegar, well, things could have gone differently. Rhaegar would not have been able to crown Lyanna, riding right past Elia. And another thing that I think about is interesting here is, I think it's important to understand what Brandon would have thought about the idea of Rhaegar. Rhaegar is this person that beats Brandon. I think Brandon, being the hothead he was, he would have taken that more personally, right? Losing in this joust. It would have been important to him. And so when you have that already in the back of his mind, and you already have the fact that he then disrespects Lyanna, that's how Brandon saw it, because Lyanna was already matched to Robert. He is angry, pissed off. He has to be restrained from attacking the prince. It brings up this picture of who Rhaegar is for Brandon's mind. Again, men are very prideful creatures. And when you have a hothead like Brandon, you're going to look at this and go, okay, already Brandon's not going to like Rhaegar because Rhaegar beat him. But then you do that to his sister. It paints this image now that Rhaegar is this awful guy. He's this, above earth prince who thinks he's better than everyone else, that can do whatever he wants. When you have that in your mind and you see what events play out, it's very important to understand the character of Brandon and his rationale, the way he goes about doing things. But we only have about a year after this, when in 282 AC, Brandon was present at Riverrun when the date for his wedding to Catelyn was announced. Again, very important date, just cementing the alliance between the Tullys and the Starks. But this would not be all that happens during this year. Peter Baelish, the ward of Catelyn's father, challenges Brandon to a duel for her hand. And if you're Brandon, you're placed in quite an awkward spot, because Littlefinger's not going to beat you, right? You're one of probably the better fighters during this time period. You're someone that has way better armor, all these different things on Baelish. And it's so weird because it's like, okay, this guy obviously was in the friend zone and he's crushing on your girl. You just kind of got to put him in his place a little bit. And so what we end up seeing is Peter Baelish feels absolutely betrayed, right? Catelyn denies him. Edmure, who he probably considered at least a friend at this time, they grew up together, being a squire for Brandon, it's not a good look. And Brandon does show honor to Baelish, right? Taking off a lot of his armor because he saw that Peter didn't have it, or didn't have those pieces of armor. And Catelyn even tries to get him to not kill Baelish, and he tries to do so, but Peter Baelish will never relent. He will never yield. And so Brandon ends up giving him an injury that nearly kills him. And what would have changed here if Brandon Stark had killed Littlefinger, right? And even through all of this, Brandon is someone that tries to be very respectful. He keeps his emotions pretty close to hand, and he tries his best, but Littlefinger just doesn't give it an option. And so now we come to this part where this is kind of the unwritten part of Brandon that we just don't know. Because here's what we have to realize happens with Brandon now. Brandon then leaves to join his father's wedding party, coming down from the north. So that's possible. But we also know that there's another thing that could have been going on here. Littlefinger leaves a little bit earlier than this. Would Brandon have wanted to hunt him down, or at least confront him about what just happened? Because you also got to remember, it's also known that Littlefinger got Lysa pregnant during this time period, but was also stating, or he will at least in the future, that he took Catelyn's maidenhead. So either way, it's an insult upon the Tully family Brandon was about to just marry into. So there's a lot of motivation, I actually think, for Brandon to go find Littlefinger, and maybe use the idea of meeting his father coming down south as a pretext. Maybe, again, we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest either way, but that's what we're told, right? The public idea here, the history says that Brandon went to leave for the father's wedding party. I'm kind of offering what I believe and kind of a counter to that. And this theory, I want to always put out that In Deep Geek popularized it, from what I can tell. He's the first person I ever heard this theory from, but I think it makes a lot of sense. But with that being said, apparently word reaches Brandon of Lyanna's supposed abduction by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. But what is even more fascinating is it seems like Brandon finds out this information before anybody else. Before anyone can get to Brandon to restrain him from going south to making a really stupid action, he's already there. It almost feels like Brandon figured this out firsthand. And that's why I really point to the idea that Brandon did find Littlefinger, and Littlefinger spun this lie, possibly seeing Rhaegar and Lyanna leaving the Crossroad Inns. It's a perfect spot for them to have met, or at least have traveled through for Rhaegar and Lyanna, but it also makes sense for Littlefinger. Littlefinger's going back to the Fingers, to the Vale, his homeland. It makes perfect sense for him, one, to go to the Crossroad Inns, and two, to actually stay there until winter is over. So all that makes sense. And this idea that comes out is that Brandon would have probably wanted to kill Littlefinger, given the dishonor that he actually did to the Tully household, or at least beat him up. And so Littlefinger says the one thing that could possibly get him out of that situation in terms of Lyanna was kidnapped by Rhaegar. Because who does Brandon hate more than Littlefinger at this time? Rhaegar, right? Rhaegar beat him in the tourney of Harrenhal where everyone was there, right? Everyone was there. And also disrespected Lyanna. And it makes complete sense building the persona of what Brandon would think of Rhaegar as being this Targaryen prince who thinks he's better than everyone else, that he can take whatever he wants and disrespect whoever he wants. And there he goes taking Lyanna. It kind of adds in there perfectly into the story of Brandon Stark. And so what does Brandon Stark do with this information? Well, taking a few of his companions like Ethan Glover, Kyle Royce, Elbert Aaron, and Joffrey Mallister, they ride to King's Landing immediately to confront Rhaegar Targaryen. But upon entering the Red Keep, Brandon shouted for Rhaegar to come out and die, which is fascinating. That is kind of the worst thing you could possibly do. Threaten the prince with death. Not a good look. And in a lot of ways, I do not blame Aerys for imprisoning Brandon. You cannot be shouting that to the king's heir, right? And so Brandon goes about this really, really, really poorly. Very poorly. He didn't really think he was very hot-headed. He let his emotion get the best of him. And it gets him killed, but also his father killed later on. This would be the catalyst for Robert's Rebellion. We've talked about this in lengths in my series. Just a very stupid move by Brandon, and it really does lead to his death. And we even know that Rhaegar wasn't here, so Brandon did not do his homework, right? He didn't do his homework in terms of, was Rhaegar here at all? Did he think rationally about actually threatening the prince in front of everybody? And so he gets charged with plotting Rhaegar's murder, and all of the fathers were called to court to answer for the charges of these men. Now, I think Aerys is completely within his rights to do all of this up to that point, until he ends up basically imprisoning anyone else that comes. Then that's stupid. And he even makes it worse by basically creating a situation in which war happens. Rickard Stark is suspended from the rafters of the throne room above a fire lit by pyromancers. Brandon's hands were chained behind his back, and a leather cord was wrapped around his neck. attached to a Tyroshi device that would tighten the cord as it was pulled on. And however, his legs were free and his sword was placed just beyond his reach, Brandon was forced to watch as his father was burned alive in his own armor and strangled himself attempting to get to the sword so he could save his father. He was only 20 at the time. And again, Brandon was someone that would fight for his loved ones. He cared, fiercely about the people next to him, and that maybe clouded his vision, clouded what he should be doing and thinking about the repercussions, and Brandon kills himself. And what is Brandon's legacy? Well, for one, he starts a war, right? His actions, it's more Rhaegar's actions, of course, and Aerys's actions, but his actions indirectly start a war and the causing of the Targaryen downfall. It causes Ned to take up the role of the Lord of Winterfell, the Warden of the North, and marrying the woman that he was supposed to marry. Other people have thought about some interesting legacy ideas with Brandon Stark. Did Brandon and Catelyn actually sleep together at some point? And that's what actually made Robb, not Ned. An interesting idea. I don't know if anything has been said to back that up, given that Catelyn doesn't think about having sex with Brandon, or even the idea that Robb could be Brandon's. But it is an interesting idea. We also know that Brandon's body, along with his father, was placed in the crypts at Winterfell, and very different than others in the past, even though Brandon was not the Lord or a King of Winterfell, was given a statue that was carved in his like. But we also know that Bran, the Bran from the normal story, was named after Ned's brother Brandon Stark. And that's kind of it, right? We know bits and pieces more about the character of Brandon. We know Bran ends up taking his sword that was in the Winterfell crypts. We'll see if that has some significance moving forward. But something that could be interesting is if we do see the spirits of the Starks come back, or the dead bodies, corpses, whatever you want to say, of the others come back, Brandon could come back with a vengeance. He died watching his father be killed and being strangled. He is someone that was a fiery wolf. He was someone that had that wolf's blood. Could we see him come back as a spirit or something of that nature? Very possible. And we even note from the last time that he's brought up in A Dance with Dragons in the crypts, Barbary Dustin states that Brandon would not have been happy with his sword being missing. Again, he was someone that always liked fighting. But that is it. That is the story of Brandon Stark, my character analysis of the character. And thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys are excited for the next one. Next week's video, we will be talking about the other son of Jaehaerys, Baelon Targaryen. We talked about Aemon in the last video, or in the next one, we'll be talking about Baelon Targaryen, the father of Viserys and Daemon Targaryen. But thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.